Good evening, everybody, and welcome to week 4 of Better Understand the Bible. It's not you better understand the Bible, as they keep jokingly saying in Genesis. I'm not trying not to take that personally, but no, it's better understand the Bible. It's an opportunity to better understand the Bible. That's the idea. And here in week 4, we're going to talk about the wisdom literature. Just by way of review, first week we did an overview of the Bible. Second week we talked about the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Last week we talked about the historical books of the Bible, and boy, there's a whole lot of them. 12 different books we sort of ran through last week. This week we're going to talk about the wisdom literature, which includes 5 books. It's Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. Those are the 5 books we're going to go through today. Just as an overview of wisdom literature as a whole, authorship will go by book because it varies depending on which book we're talking about. But in terms of types of literature we're going to be dealing with tonight, it's going to be a mix. It's going to be a lot of narrative, a lot of storytelling, and a lot of poetry. Those are going to be the 2 primary forms of literature that we're looking at tonight. Wisdom is often portrayed as a female, as a woman, lady wisdom. And you'll see that a lot, especially in, I believe it is Proverbs is where we see that mostly. But you see it in other spots as well. But it's a very poetic treatment of wisdom, a personification of wisdom as a woman. The wisdom literature, it's not law, like we've looked at in terms of the laws that were in the Torah and some of the laws that were in the historical books. It's not prophecy like the prophetic books that we're going to look at next week. Wisdom literature is really practical advice for living a God-honoring life. It's saying we've got all of these laws, all of these rules, all of this history that we've been living through. How do we take all of that and how do we live it out? How do we, in a practical way, bring all of those laws, all those rules, this idea of being holy, of being set apart? What does that look like in reality as we live it out? So there's very practical nature to the wisdom literature. It assumes that human beings can learn from their experiences and pass along that knowledge through these books. That's the idea of wisdom literature. Okay, here's how we've screwed it up. Learn from our experience so you don't screw it up like we did. That's really, in a very thumbnail fashion, what we're looking at with the wisdom literature. So we're going to go through each of the 5 books, and we're going to start with the Book of Job. The Book of Job is actually one of my favorite books of the Bible, so I'm always excited when we get to talk about it. Its authorship is unknown, but it is believed to be the oldest story in the Bible. And Job himself was a Gentile, was not a Jew. So this kind of central book in the Bible is about a person who was not Jewish. He's actually a Gentile. It is primarily narrative, primarily a story, which doesn't mean that it didn't actually happen. We have no idea. There could have actually been a man named Job, and all of these horrible things happened to him, and God and people were discussing him. The point is that when you're dealing with narrative, when you're dealing with a story, the historicity, its historical factual nature, is not the point. When you're dealing with a story, you're dealing with a moral or some sort of point to that story, and there's actually a couple of main points to the book of Job. The very first verse of the book of Job says, "There once was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job." And if that sounds like once upon a time, or if that sounds like a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, that's the point. The author is alerting you right out of the gate. We're talking about a story here. Don't worry so much about whether it's historically factual. Worry about the moral. Worry about the points of the story. And there are 2 that I want to point out in the book of Job. The first one is that there are elements affecting our lives, affecting what happens to us, that we are unable to perceive. So the thumbnail sketch of the book of Job is this. It starts out with God bragging up the faithfulness of his servant Job, of this human being named Job. And a character that's called the Satan, which translates from the Hebrew to the accuser. And we can talk at another point about whether that's the devil or not. But this accuser comes along and says, hey, you know what? The only reason that Job is faithful to you is because his life's going so well. If a bunch of bad stuff happened to him, then he wouldn't be as faithful to you as he is. And it turns into almost this sort of betting situation between God and the accuser, in which a bunch of bad things then happen to Job, and we see whether Job's faith changes or not. But the point is that there's all this stuff going on. Job's never aware of why these bad things are happening to him. He has no idea what's going on in this spiritual realm. Different people believe different things when it comes to this idea of spiritual warfare. But I think it's safe to assume that if you're willing to embrace the concept of spiritual beings, if you're willing to embrace the concept of God and angels, then it's not an enormous leap to think of some sort of manifest evil. And I don't get too much into terms like principalities and powers and demons and Satan and the devil and all these things, because unfortunately those terms conjure up almost cartoonish images of those ideas. And it sort of sets people into thinking, I can't believe in that. That's a cartoon. But the truth is that there's reasons that evil exists that have nothing to do with God. And however you want to conceptualize that evil, there is a manifest evil out there, I believe, that affects how things work. And that's really what, this, when it comes to what happens to Job, that's what's going on. There's this kind of spiritual warfare going on in a realm that he can't perceive. We see it because we're outside the story, but he never knows why these bad things happen to him. And that leads to the second point, which is that bad things can happen to good people. That's another point of this story. Just because something bad happened to you doesn't mean that you didn't have enough faith. That's the argument that goes on. Job has a couple of buddies that tell him that all these things, bad things that happened to him, means that he must have done something wrong. He must have been lacking in faith. He must not have prayed hard enough. He must have sinned in some way. And Job protesting these guys, I didn't do anything that I wasn't doing before. This can't be my fault. But in their worldview, if he hadn't done something wrong and all these horrible things happened to him, well, that means that bad things can happen to good people. And that scares the you-know-what out of these guys. So they're insisting on a theology that they're looking at evidence which won't support it, but they're insisting that the theology is more important than the evidence right in front of their eyes. And there's this argument that goes back and forth. And eventually we end up in Job chapter 38, which was one of the assigned chapters for this week, where God starts to explain to them, there's all this stuff going on that you guys can't see and that you guys can't perceive. The way I try to explain it is, imagine that you're looking at a giant tapestry, okay? Huge picture hanging on the wall of a castle. Now imagine that you can only see 1 square inch of that tapestry, and you can see that square inch very, very well. You can see a lot of detail in that square inch, but you really can't, from 1 square inch of this gigantic tapestry, extrapolate as to what else is going on. You can see how the threads in your square inch interact with each other, but you can't see how a thread on the other, 10 feet away on this tapestry somehow affects what you're doing. And that's what God's trying to communicate. You guys, there's all this other stuff going on that I can see, that I can perceive, that you can't. Quit trying to figure out why it is that bad things happen to good people. Just accept the fact that that is the truth. And really, to me, the important part of this is that when you hear a preacher preaching the prosperity gospel, when you hear somebody saying that God wants you to be happy and healthy and rich and successful in life and get the promotion at work and marry a prettier spouse and get a bigger house and all of these things, and all you have to do is pray hard enough and believe hard enough and have enough faith, and give to my church enough money, and all these good things are going to happen to you, that's horrible, horrible theology, because it sets people up so that because we know bad things happen to good people. We've seen it experientially in all of our lives many, many times. When that happens, what happens to your faith? Well, I thought all these good things were going to happen to me because I prayed hard enough and I had deep enough faith and I gave to the right church and I did all the right things, and still bad things happened to me, or I didn't get the promotion, or I didn't get the bigger house, or I didn't get the prettier spouse. What does that mean? And it just destroys people internally. It destroys their faith. And so I pound my fist on the pulpit all the time, raging against the prosperity gospel. Bad things do happen to good people, and we don't really have great explanations. One of the theological term you'll hear in seminary is the problem of evil, which means how does an all good, all loving, all powerful God allow a creation to exist in which evil exists? And there is no good singular answer for that. There's no good answer, no singular good answer in the Christian faith or in any other faith or in atheism. There is no singular good answer for that. And it's a big thing that keeps people away from faith, because they see horrible things happening and go, why am I investing any amount of time and worship in a God that allows a 14-year-old kid to brutally murder a 10-year-old in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin? How can that possibly happen? Well, there's a million different reasons that happened. And none of them are God saying, well, that needed to happen for this reason or that reason or that reason. Bad things happen to good people, and there's not great explanations for it. And that's a big barrier to a lot of people for faith. But as I said, no singular faith or lack of faith has a good answer for it either. Evil is a horrible, horrible reality that we have to live with, whether you're a person of faith or whether you're not a person of faith. And so that's reinforced here in the book of Job. The true wisdom of the book of Job is in the knowing that there are things we can't know and things that we don't know. And that from that knowing, it inspires an idea of humility, or a feeling of a posture of humility within us. We don't know everything. And anybody who does try to tell you that they do know everything is probably trying to sell you a book of some sort. So be very, very careful about that. Okay. That's the book of Job. It's not really a satisfying conclusion to that book, but to me, that's actually one of the points in that book's favor. Because if you were going to make something up, if you were going to do like a prosperity gospel, if you do all these great things, then all these great things will happen to you, guaranteed. That's probably it's a very convincing narrative. It's something that's appealing to people. Saying, look, there's stuff going on that you just don't get, and I'm sorry, you're just not going to get it, isn't a very satisfying thing, which to me has a ring of truth to it. Because experientially in life, we know that there's a bunch of things that happen that we don't really get. Just a thought on that one. I'm going to go through the Psalms, and then we'll go ahead and take a break and ask for any questions here. When we look at the book of Psalms, authorship is primarily attributed to King David. And I say it's attributed to because it's traditional in the sense that the Torah was traditional, right? We talked about with the Torah that, Moses is traditionally credited with having written those 5 books, except there's these 7 verses at the end of Deuteronomy after he died that I'm guessing he probably could not have written. Much the same way, did David write all the Psalms? Definitely not. Not all of them are attributed to him. And all of those that are attributed to him, did he write all of those? Yeah, maybe not. We don't necessarily know. But David traditionally is the author of most of the Psalms. There are some other priests and scribes that are specifically attributed to having written specific Psalms. But most of the attribution goes to David. Type of literature when we're dealing with Psalms is mainly poetry. Mainly poetry. And the thing about when you're looking at biblical poetry is you have to think metaphorically a lot. And just as when we talked about Esther, using that lens where we're looking for God moving behind what's being written, that's a lens that very, very much helps you when you're looking at the Psalms, looking for God in the margins, looking for God in the background. What is God doing here? Because while most of the Bible is essentially the story of God's interaction with his creation, is trying to explain God in such a way that our finite, limited minds can grasp on to somehow what God's doing and how we relate to what God's doing. The Psalms are different. The Psalms are the one book in the Bible where it's us talking to God instead of God speaking to us. And that's a very important thing because prayer is not something that comes naturally to everybody. Some people are very, very talented and it comes very, very easily to them. And there's other of us that really struggle with how do you pray? What's it seems at times facetious, or it seems at times formulaic, or it seems at times just pointless. When you start to feel that way, and I say this from personal experience, my strong recommendation is to go to the Psalms, because the Psalms will show you how to pray. The Psalms will show you different ideas of prayer. The Psalms will communicate certain emotions, will communicate certain ideas that maybe you're struggling with. And it's where I believe we most meet the Holy Spirit is in the book of Psalms. You can break the Psalms down into any number of different types of categories. But if you take a look at that document that I gave you guys, Walter Brueggemann is an Old Testament scholar, and he breaks it down into these 3 main categories: orientation, disorientation, and new orientation. And I have affinity for that in a lot of different ways. It just makes sense to me on some basic level. And the way that we teach at Genesis, where we talk about new beginnings all the time, this sort of has that flow to it. You have Psalms of orientation, which are just about praise and worshiping God. Pardon me. You have Psalms of disorientation, where things have gone horribly wrong, and you're shaking your fist at God going, why are you letting this happen to me? And then you have Psalms of new orientation, because we know that out of death comes rebirth and resurrection and new beginnings and new life. And that's sort of the way that these flow. Now, I say flow, the Psalms don't flow linearly in terms of their numbering situation. They're not grouped together in this regard. And if you look on that sheet that I showed you, you can see how the numbers are kind of all over the place. There are maybe small pockets of groupings of Psalms, but there's no really overall any general idea to it. But I do want to kind of walk through these a little bit and give you some examples. When we're talking about Psalms of orientation, again, we're talking about praise and worship of God. And you see that first subcategory, songs of creation, and I have listed there Psalm 19. Psalm 19 was C.S. Lewis's favorite psalm. C.S. Lewis was a huge fan of medieval literature and the medieval idea of the 7 heavens. he was especially had an affinity for. In fact, I have a book written by a scholar who did his doctoral dissertation, which surmised that the 7 books of the Narnia series were actually each connected to one of the 7 heavens. And he lays it all out. It's a very interesting theory. In fact, he did a part of it writing at C.S. Lewis's old house, and had a meeting with a friend of Lewis's, and he laid out the theory for this friend. And the friend said, you know, I can't tell you for sure whether or not Carl did that, but that'd be the exact kind of thing he would do. So there's that kind of evidence for it anyway. But Psalm 19 is the psalm that starts, the heavens declare the glory of the Lord. And it's a lot about this idea of seeing God through creation, about, they call it natural revelation, that the order of nature, the way that nature is interconnected, the way that we're learning even now in science that atoms and their kind of entanglement and what all that entails demonstrates an intelligence, demonstrates the existence of God. And that's where that psalm kind of fits in there. Songs of Torah, wisdom psalms. We talked about wisdom literature today here, obviously. Songs of retribution. Those all fit under this notion of psalms of orientation. But it's the Psalms of disorientation that to me may be the most important, because there's been this teaching over time that it is somehow blasphemous to ask God a question, that it is somehow wrong to have a doubt. It is somehow wrong to look around and see the chaos of life and go, what are you even doing right now? Oh, no, I can't do that. I can't, that God, as though God has got such a fragile ego that any questioning, any doubting, any, what in the is going on is going to throw him, into a rage. That's Greek god mythology. That's Zeus up there with the lightning bolt ready to zap you type mythology. What God desires more than anything is relationship. And part of relationship, as we all know, is fighting with that person that you're in relationship to. There comes conflict. It's a natural part of it. Trust me when I tell you this. Any amount of shaking your fist and asking God what in the world is going on, God can take. God can take that. God's not a house of cards. God's not going to collapse just because, Dan sits here and looks around at the chaos in the world and says, what in the world's going on? God, where are you? What are you doing? And the evidence that I have for that is plentiful, both in the Torah, because Moses does it, both in the historical books, because the prophets do it, and here in the Psalms. You have these Psalms of Lamentation. There are personal laments and there are communal laments. God, why are you letting this happen to me? That's Psalm 6 that I had you read. God, why are you having this happen to me? Why aren't you here? Why aren't you stopping this? Why do I have to suffer? And there are the Psalms of communal lament. Why is this happening to us? Why are we as a people suffering? Why is Russia invading our country and bombing the snot out of us right now? These are real. These are very, very real laments. These are very, very real ways of communicating with God. Like I said, what God wants more than anything is relationship. So if you're coming to God and saying, why are you doing this? Why are you letting this happen? What's going on? You're doing so because on some fundamental level, you trust God to answer. You trust God to be there and at least take the verbiage, take the venting, if you will. What God doesn't want is for you to get ticked off and walk away and say, the heck with you, I don't want any part of you. The Psalms of Lament are this relationship with God, are this venting towards God, and hopefully at some point hearing something back. You don't always. But what you'll notice in most of the Psalms of Lament, not all of them, but most of them will be 2/3 to 3/4 of this venting. Why are you letting this happen? And they resolve into, but I still have faith, but I still follow you, but I still know that you are God. And I think that's, to me, an important flow, is to know that you can vent to God and that God can take it and that God's not going to be mad at you for doing it. And at the same time, while you're angry and confused and scared and all of the things, you can still have that faith. It's not one or the other, that they actually both go together, because we see them right together in these Psalms. And then there are the Psalms of new orientation, which is finding your way through the dark times, through the wilderness, and coming out on the other side. And again, those both have a personal and a communal versions of them. The most famous Psalm, perhaps, is Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. That's Psalm 23. And that's somebody who's been through some tough times that says, thank you, Lord, for being with me through those tough times. And I know that there'll be tough times to come, and I know that you'll be there with me. And I know you'll anoint my head with oil and set a table before me and my enemies. as we go through those tough times together. The Psalms are our prayer book, and they're hugely, hugely important. Can't stress that enough. But to me, it's whenever you're confused, whenever you're upset, whenever you don't know what to make with your relationship with God, the Psalms are exactly where to go. And there's a reason that so many worship songs come directly out of the Psalms, that they use those lyrics directly out of the Psalms, because it's one of the best ways we know to communicate with God. And we continue with the Book of Proverbs. The Book of Proverbs is mainly attributed authorship-wise to King Solomon, son of King David. Again, this is a tradition in the way these other books have been traditionally attributed to certain people. We don't know that Solomon wrote every bit of it, but Solomon is treated as the father of Israel's wisdom tradition. So you're actually going to see in the next 3 books, Solomon plays a major presence in all of them. Again, type of literature, this is very much poetry. The Book of Psalms is mainly known for the short, pithy wisdom sayings. That's what everybody thinks of when they think of Proverbs. That doesn't actually start until chapter 10 of Proverbs. The first 10 chapters are lectures sort of from a father figure to a son figure. But again, it's very much in this tradition of wisdom literature, practical ideas for living out a life in honor of God, in the trajectory that God has laid out for us. What's interesting is when we get to those kind of pithy sayings in the middle, that style there, if you read through those or read through some of those and then go read the Sermon on the Mount, which starts in Matthew chapter 5, you'll feel a pattern there. You'll see that a lot of what Jesus sort of patterned that Sermon on the Mount after were these Proverbs. Here's a short saying, here's an explainer for it. Here's a short saying, here's an explainer for it. That's very much that style. So there's a connection here with the New Testament. Overall, again, this book is trying to explain to you how to live well in God's world, how to live along this trajectory that God has laid out for us, how to be holy, how to be set apart, but in a practical way. What does it mean to actually live that way? How does that actually work? The most important thing when reading the Book of Psalms is to understand that the Book of Proverbs is that the Proverbs are probabilities, they're not promises. It's very easy. Again, remember, we're dealing with translating Hebrew into English, and that doesn't happen just on a one-to-one basis. So it's when you leave Hebrew and you enter English, the way that they're written out can sound very much like a promise. If you do this, this thing will happen for you. If you don't do this, this other thing will happen to you, as though those are almost math equations. That's not what's going on here. Because we know in previous books and in books to come that there are no guarantees, that bad things can happen to good people. But the idea is, if you want to give yourself the best shot in life, if you want to live a life and have the best chance at having a fruitful life, if you want to keep to God's path as best you can, here's the ways to do it. Here are some wisdom ideas to keep in mind. That doesn't guarantee that bad things won't happen to you. It just gives you the best chance, as opposed to wandering off in a different direction where bad things will almost certainly happen to you. That's the vibe of the Book of Proverbs. So you have to have that in mind as you're reading these things, because otherwise it does become very transactional. If I do A, then I get B, and that's not how life works. We saw that in Job, and we see that in the next book that we're going to talk about, Ecclesiastes. This is the video that I had you watch. So a lot of what I talk about here will be repetitive from that video, but authorship of Ecclesiastes, again, traditionally gets given to Solomon. Some people speculate that it's actually a later Davidic king, one of the great-grandchildren of David. And there's others that speculate that it's just a teacher taking on a Solomon-like presence, that he's speaking as though he were Solomon to communicate these wisdom ideas, because he knows that as soon as you start talking in a Solomon voice, people are going to understand that these are wisdom sayings that you're talking about, that it's wisdom literature that you're sharing. There's a mix here of both narrative, storytelling, and poetry. And what's interesting about the book of Ecclesiastes, it might be the most debated book in the entire Bible, because there are still scholars today, plenty of scholars, debating about how you interpret this book, who plays what role, what kind of metaphors are being used here. And there's, like I said, there's a lot of different theories, and none of them stand out as, oh no, this one's the most accepted one. You'll find all kinds of scholars all over the place on this one. For me, and again, this is my opinion, what I think the author is trying to get us to understand in Ecclesiastes is that when we search for meaning and when we search for purpose in things that are not God, when we try to get our value from how much money we have, or how big our house is, or how nice our car is, or how attractive our spouse is, all of those things. When we try to find meaning and purpose there, we are destined to fail. Because trying to grab meaning in those things, it talks, depending on which translation you look at, it'll say useless, useless, all is useless. Or the Hebrew word that they keep coming back to it means like vapor or smoke. And it's saying, if you try to grab a hold of vapor or smoke, how successful are you going to be? If you try to find purpose or meaning in things outside of God, you're going to be that successful as though you were trying to grab a hold of smoke. So on acknowledging that most of life is kind of out of our control takes a lot of that pressure off of us to do things exactly right, because bad things can happen to good people. There's so much that's going on in the world we have no control over. And yet we fight for this sense of certainty. We fight for this sense of control. And what the author of Ecclesiastes says is that's wasted energy. That you're wasting your time. You're trying to grab smoke as you do all of that stuff. That the way to get through life, the most successful way to get through life is understanding just how much isn't out of your control, and thereby rely on God, who does have control over all of these things. It can seem a little simplistic, but that's what they're driving at in these books. And if you watch the video again, it sort of will fill in a lot of the gaps there for you. The final book is the Song of Songs, which is called Song of Songs in some places. Other places you'll see it called Song of Solomon. And again, authorship here is traditionally attributed to Solomon. We don't really know if he wrote it or not. But again, when you attribute it to Solomon, then people understand immediately that you're talking about wisdom literature. You're talking about a way to try and practically communicate how to live a godly life in our world. A lot of poetry here, a lot of poetry. There's a lot of shifting back and forth between a male narrator and a female narrator. And actually, the female narrator gets most of the lines, gets more lines than the male narrator does. But it's exploring ideas of love and sexual attraction. It's communicating the idea that love is a beautiful thing and a powerful thing. And that if it is abused, it can be very, very harmful to other people. It tells us that we all have an innate desire to be known and to be desired, and that that's not a bad thing. What's bad is when we see that in someone else and we manipulate it for our benefit, and we end up doing harm to that person. What the Bible really teaches when it comes to sexuality is to have respect for the power of love and sexuality. And that's a very fine line to walk. You'll see throughout the wisdom literature, you'll see this phrase, fear of the Lord, in there a bunch. And that's something that gets misunderstood, because it's easy to think when you see fear of the Lord to think I have to be scared because the Lord's going to punish me. I have to be scared of that person. Fear of the Lord is not about being scared of God. Fear of the Lord is about respecting God's awesome power. That this is a God that created a universe that's 13.8 billion years old. I can't tell you what I had for breakfast yesterday. There's a difference, okay? There's a gap there. But even in more practical terms, my father is a retired police officer, never once in his life laid a finger on me, didn't spank me, didn't smack me, and trust me when I tell you as a child, I deserved it plenty of times. Never laid a finger on me. And yet growing up, I had a very healthy respect for the fact that if my father did want to lay a hand on me, he could kick my butt in about 10 seconds. Never did, never even threatened to, but he just had that presence as an officer, as a bigger guy, that made me kind of be aware and be not fearful of him, but respectful of the power that he had. That's what we're talking about when we're talking fear of the Lord, is respect for God's power, is respect for the fact that God knows more and can control more than we do. And respect plays a role here when we're talking about love and sexuality. Love and sexuality aren't things to be afraid of. They're things to be respected because they carry a tremendous power with them. And so when we start, unfortunately, what's happened in the church is that that's gotten twisted into this purity culture. It's gotten twisted into this idea that women's bodies are somehow bad and that they somehow tempt men in ways that men can't possibly control themselves. And so women have this shame piled upon them, and you have to be careful what you wear, and you have to be careful about how you present yourself. And, oh, you say that you were sexually assaulted. Well, how were you dressed when you were sexually assaulted? That question has no business ever being asked. Okay. But we've taught young women, especially of a particular generation, that they need to be almost ashamed of feeling pretty, of feeling sexual, of feeling like they're deserving of love, because those things are somehow going to tempt men into acts that are sinful. And that's garbage. It's all garbage. I can't say that enough. It is all complete garbage. As much as we have taught young women about how they should dress and how they should present themselves, what we should have been doing is teaching young men that I don't care if a woman walks up to you stark naked, you don't get to lay a finger on her without her consent. Period. End of story. If we had spent as much time lecturing young boys about how to behave as we have lecturing young women how to behave, a whole lot of problems could have been avoided. The Bible doesn't teach you to be ashamed of your sexuality. The Bible doesn't teach you to be ashamed of wanting to love people and wanting to be loved. It does teach that you should have a tremendous amount of respect for those things, because there's tremendous power in intimacy. You are never more vulnerable than when you are intimate with another person. And when you're vulnerable with that person can clobber you if they're not respectful of your feelings or respectful of the gift of love and the gift of intimacy and the gift of sexuality. I'm sorry, I'm preaching a little bit here right now, but I think this is an important point. And I think that's a key point with the Song of Songs. Yes, the Song of Songs is talking about sex. The traditional Jewish interpretation has the male figure being God and the female figure being the people of Israel. And traditional Christian teaching would have the male figure being Jesus and the female figure being the church. They keep wanting to turn it into metaphors, because if it's metaphorical, then the sexuality of it is toned down and isn't as threatening. No, the reality is that they are talking about love and sex in those terms. That when you read through the Song of Songs, it doesn't lend itself to metaphor. The kind of mental gymnastics you have to do to make metaphors out of what they're talking about is exhausting. Instead, it should be read literally in terms of they're just talking about love and they're talking about sexuality and they're talking about the importance of those things and the power of those things and the respect that we should have for those things. That's the Song of Songs. And that's the wisdom literature. So I want to stop here. We're going to move on to a question and answer period for the folks that are here on Zoom. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you for being with us, and we hope you join us next week.